Good evening, generals, and welcome once again to our series Men Around the Führer, tonight's tale of Robert Ley, which is less a straight historical biography and more a cautionary tale about the perils of absolute loyalty, unbounded ambition, and the corrosive power of corruption, all set against the backdrop of one of history's most terrifying experiments in totalitarian control. He was a man who, despite holding enormous political power, was never truly accepted into the innermost sanctuary of the ruling elite, remaining an outlier whose personal vices were as notorious as his public fervor. Ley was, in essence, the perpetually zealous apprentice who commanded the masses, yet struggled continually against his own flawed nature and the ruthless rivals who surrounded him. Robert Ley was born into hardship on February 15, 1890, in Niederbreitenbach, emerging as the seventh of 11 children born to Friedrich Ley, a humble farmer in the Rhine province. His childhood was marred by profound social shame and poverty after his father was convicted of arson, having attempted to claim insurance money to escape overwhelming debt. This experience, the poverty and the disgrace, left a deep and lasting sense of social insecurity in young Ley, fueling a resentment against the upper classes that would inform his political views for the rest of his life. Despite these bitter origins, Ley pursued learning diligently, studying chemistry at the universities of Jena, Bonn, and Münster. Yet, the quiet pursuit of science was shattered by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, when Ley volunteered for the Imperial German Army. He served 2 years in the artillery on both the Eastern and Western fronts before being promoted to lieutenant and training as an aerial artillery spotter. In July 1917, high above the battlefields of France, fate delivered a blow that would forever mark him. His aircraft was shot down, and he was taken prisoner of war. The crash was catastrophic, leaving Ley with serious injuries, including possible traumatic damage to the frontal lobe of his brain. The result was a permanent speech impediment, a stammer, and a lifelong predisposition for unstable and often erratic behavior, symptoms tragically exacerbated by his subsequent chronic and heavy consumption of alcohol. Upon his release in January 1920, Ley completed his academic journey, earning his doctorate later that year. He secured a position as a food chemist at a local branch of the enormous IG Farben chemical conglomerate based in Leverkusen in the Ruhr region. But Ley was not destined for a quiet life in industry. The French occupation of the Ruhr in 1924, a bitter national humiliation, fully radicalized him, turning him into a fervent ultra-nationalist. He was captivated by the words of Adolf Hitler following the beer hall putsch trial and promptly joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party in 1925, shortly after its ban was lifted. This political zealotry proved far stronger than his commitment to his career. By 1928, he lost his job at IG Farben, a dismissal hastened not only by his escalating alcohol problem, but also by his inflammatory public attacks on a Jewish banker. Ley's entry into the National Socialist movement was marked by immediate, unswerving, and fanatical devotion to Hitler. This absolute loyalty became Ley's most defining and strategically important characteristic, ensuring that Hitler would continually ignore the many complaints lodged against him concerning his incompetence, arrogance, and habitual drunkenness. Ley quickly ascended the party ladder, becoming the regional leader for southern Rhineland in 1925. Though he showed certain sympathies for the Strasserite faction, which advocated for a greater focus on the working class, Ley demonstrated where his ultimate allegiance lay during a crucial internal party dispute. When the Strasser brothers challenged Hitler at a meeting in Hanover over the expropriation of former royal properties, Ley and Gottfried Feder were the only prominent figures to stand with the Führer. This act of timely defense cemented Ley's place in Hitler's favor, a debt the Führer never forgot. Even Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, who openly disliked Ley and dismissed him as a pure blockhead, was forced to acknowledge the power of this bond. Ley's political trajectory continued upward. He was elected to the Prussian state parliament in 1928 and then to the Reichstag, the German parliament, in 1930. In 1932, he was brought to the party headquarters in Munich, replacing Gregor Strasser as chief of staff and head of party organization. When Hitler officially became chancellor in January 1933, Ley accompanied him to Berlin. Later that year, Ley was elevated to the prestigious rank of national leader. His final and most enduring party title came in late 1934, National Organization Head of the Nazi Party. In this capacity, Ley became officially in charge of orchestrating the grand and spectacular party rallies held in Nuremberg. The true foundation of Robert Ley's power was laid in the spring of 1933, following Hitler's seizure of government authority. Hitler, aiming for the total mobilization of the general population and the abolition of any organization that could rival the party, demanded the destruction of the independent trade unions. While the Nazi regime staged a massive celebration for May 1st, proclaiming it National Labor Day, Ley was simultaneously issuing the directives for the union's definitive destruction. On April 21st, 1933, Ley, then the staff chief of the party's political organizations, issued a circular ordering the action to coordinate the free trade unions. The circular specified that the operation was to begin sharply at 10:00 a.m. on Tuesday, May 2nd, 1933. This seizure was militaristic in nature, requiring the deployment of the Storm Detachment, SA, and the Protection Squadron, SS, to occupy Union properties and take leaders into protective custody. However, Ley was careful to manage the perception of this hostile takeover. He instructed that local union employees should be urged to continue their work. The takeover had to proceed in a manner that convinced workers and employees that the action was not directed against them, but rather against a superannuated system that does not conform to the interests of the German nation. On May 10, 1933, Ley organized the consolidation of the seized Union assets and oversaw the establishment of the German Labor Front. He proclaimed the new organization's purpose was to create a genuine, social, and productive community. The German Labor Front quickly swelled into the largest mass organization created by the National Socialists, eventually boasting 25 million members by the war's end. As its leader, Robert Ley earned the formidable title of the more undisputed dictator of labor in Germany. Yet the promise of liberation for the working class was swiftly and brutally exposed as an illusion. Just 3 weeks after the German Labor Front's founding, a decree was issued banning collective bargaining. Labor trustees, appointed by Hitler, were mandated to regulate contracts and maintain labor peace. This action effectively outlawed strikes, stripping workers of their sole true power, the ability to withhold their labor. Ley himself promised to restore absolute leadership to the natural leader of a factory, that is, the employer. Only the employer can decide, confirming that the organization served to enforce totalitarian control and maintain the employer's authority. Workers found themselves totally controlled by their employers. Ley famously declared his objective was to assert total control over the lives of the populace, asserting that people should have a private life only when they were asleep. To enforce this total control, the German Labor Front wielded immense bureaucratic power. In February 1935, the Mono workbook system was introduced. Every worker was required to possess a workbook detailing their skills and employment history, and crucially, employers kept these books. If a worker attempted to quit, the employer could simply refuse to release the workbook, thereby preventing the worker from being legally employed anywhere else. Ley's public stance and organizational philosophy contained strong strains of anti-capitalist rhetoric, often positioning National Socialism as the true form of worker liberation. Ley explicitly attacked the core liberal concept of private ownership, declaring, "Today the owner can no longer tell us, 'My factory is my private affair.' That was before. That's over now. The people inside of it depend on his factory for their contentment, and these people belong to us. This is no longer a private affair. This is a public matter, and he must think and act accordingly and answer for it." The organization itself was defined as combating both capitalism and liberalism. Ley restructured workplace language, changing the terms from employer and employee to leader and follower, with the leader being responsible for the welfare of the followers, who in turn owed him dutifulness. Ley passionately argued that anti-Semites who supported capitalism were uninformed reactionaries, who clung to the golden calf of capitalism, an ideology he saw as Jewish-influenced and designed to exploit and divide the populace. This worldview linked the fight against capitalism inextricably with the fight against the Jewish state. Under Ley's direction, the German Labor Front did pursue policies aimed at improving the standard of living for German workers, at least on paper, and subordinating the economic elite to the goals of the Nazi state. For example, court proceedings revealed a focus on employee well-being. In 1939, 14 hearings were held against workers, compared to 153 against plant managers, assistant managers, and supervisors, with 7 directors reportedly losing their jobs. Ley successfully advocated tapping into the profits of industry to elevate the standard of living for labor, pushing for mandatory health care coverage, and arguing that employers should continue to pay 70% of a sick worker's salary. In a telling demonstration of tenacity, Ley even confronted Hitler directly in April 1944, arguing tenaciously for equal pay for women in the armaments industry, forcing Hitler to compromise by allowing bonuses to compensate for a lower base pay. This commitment to social welfare policies for the national community was layered over the economic reality of totalitarian control. While the regime utilized initial privatizations pragmatically to raise quick cash, the overall trend was an increasing control of the state over the whole economy through regulation and political interference. Ley's own organization quickly became renowned as perhaps the most corrupt of all the major institutions of the Third Reich, accumulating a massive annual income, $160 million by 1937. From compulsory worker dues, funds which were never publicly accounted for. Ley's massive bureaucratic domain inevitably dragged him into the relentless competition for power that characterized Hitler's inner circle. Hitler often relied on overlapping areas of responsibility, creating a political market where agencies like the German Labor Front fought viciously against rivals like the Ministry of Economic Affairs and the Ministry of Employment to secure influence and resources, or rents. By promoting policies acceptable to the Führer, Ley sought to aggrandize the German Labor Front's territory by trying to usurp competence over commercial and industrial policy. His organization directly inherited the immense property and funds of the destroyed trade unions. Bureaucratic heads like Ley sought property rights that allowed them to appropriate rents, thereby passing the costs of rewarding successful bureaus on to the population, treating the rents granted as additional and discriminatory taxes. Ley impressed Hitler by acting with particular ruthlessness against rivals, preemptively usurping property rights and hoping Hitler would retroactively confirm his actions. He and other ambitious officials were well aware that Hitler's choice between competing bureaus often depended on who was most successful in pushing aside rivals and in usurping property rights. To manage labor disaffection caused by the elimination of worker rights, the German Labor Front established the Leisure Organization, Strength Through Joy, in November 1933. The underlying philosophy was articulated clearly by Ley. He believed the average German had 3,740 hours of free time annually, and he wished to ensure this time was not wasted. The movement aimed to divert the attention of the masses from material to moral values, believing that contentment gained through leisure would lead directly to increased productivity and intense work. The organization was wildly successful as a propaganda vehicle, providing mass access to activities once reserved for the wealthy. By 1937, 1.7 million people participated in package tours, and 7 million enjoyed weekend excursions. Activities spanned subsidized holidays, such as a week in the Harz Mountains for 28 marks, or a fortnight at Lake Constance for 65 marks. Athletic events, including coaching in golf, skiing and tennis, factory libraries, concerts, theater visits, and adult education. These cultural events often utilized mobile stages and buses equipped with film projectors, known as traveling theaters. A complementary program, Beauty of Labor, aimed to improve the aesthetics of workplaces by promoting cleaner, more orderly environments, adding flowers, improving ventilation, and creating small parks near factories for breaks. While these visible improvements boosted morale, they were fundamentally about building productivity and loyalty. Crucially, the organization did not provide funds for these changes. The factory owners or workers themselves were expected to pay. The grandest display of strength through joy involved construction and travel. Ley commissioned two of the world's first purpose-built cruise ships, the Wilhelm Gustloff and the MV Robert Ley, which was considered the flagship of the fleet. The MV Robert Ley, owned by the German Labor Front, had a capacity for 1,510 passengers and was revolutionary because it was designed with equality in mind. Passengers and crew members had the same kind of cabins, a rarity for the time. Ley also initiated major construction projects, such as the colossal Prora beach resort on the island of Rügen, conceived as the world's largest holiday resort, intended to house 20,000 people. However, the signature project and the organization's most infamous failure was the people's car. Hitler believed every German family should own a car and tasked Ferdinand Porsche with designing an affordable model. Ley's German Labor Front took over the project's funding, viewing private industry as having failed due to its short-sightedness, malevolence, profiteering, and stupidity. The price was set at an affordable 990 marks, roughly equivalent to 35 weeks of average wages. Ley inaugurated a massive pay-before-you-get-it installment plan where workers paid 5 marks per week until they accumulated 750 marks, earning an order number. This campaign convinced over 330,000 workers to apply, pouring millions of marks into the fund. The deception was absolute. Production of the people's car, which was supposed to be rolling off the assembly line by 1939, was immediately converted entirely to military vehicle production upon the outbreak of World War II. Consequently, none of the 340,000 workers who paid for a car ever received one. Beneath the veneer of the dedicated labor leader, Ley's private life was marked by extreme excess, chronic drunkenness, and personal violence. He freely embezzled funds from the German Labor Front for personal use, complementing his numerous generous salaries. He owned an opulent estate near Cologne, multiple villas, a private railway carriage, expensive cars, giving 2 to his second wife as gifts, and a large art collection. His chaotic personal life reached tragic heights following his divorce from his first wife, Elisabeth Schmidt, in 1938. He married the young soprano Inga Spilker, a union rapidly destroyed by his escalating alcoholism and violent behavior. Incidents of public humiliation were reported, including one account that he tore his wife's clothes off in front of guests to display her body. Inge, unable to cope with his drunkenness, became a drug addict and tragically shot herself dead in December 1942 after a violent argument. Despite these failings and the mounting complaints, Ley maintained Hitler's favor. Hitler's secretary, Traudl Junge, noted that Ley's perpetual irritation of the Führer, combined with his speech impediment that made him speak sheer nonsense, somehow did not detract from his place in the inner circle. However, Ley's functional influence declined sharply during the war. His role as Tsar of the German workforce was overshadowed by Armaments Minister Albert Speer, who took over key labor decisions, and Fritz Sauckel, the general plenipotentiary for the distribution of labor, who managed the vast influx of foreign slave laborers. Ley was relegated primarily to his newly created role in 1940, Reich Commissioner for Social Housing Construction, intended to mitigate the damage caused by Allied air raids. Even in his diminished wartime role, Ley was deeply implicated in the systematic mistreatment of forced labor, attending meetings where coercion and brutal discipline were openly discussed. He referred to Russian slave laborers using dehumanizing language, demanding they be beaten by ordinary German workers. The one area where Ley's energy never flagged was in his dedication to radical, barbarous, anti-Semitic agitation. He was one of the most visible and venomous propagandists of the regime. Ley openly called for the annihilation of the Jewish race, publishing brochures illustrated with virulent anti-Semitic caricatures resembling those found in the notorious weekly newspaper, Der Stürmer. Ley's rhetoric framed the war not as a conventional conflict, but as an apocalyptic struggle between the true National Socialist worldview and Jewish internationalism. He openly stated that Jewish influences underpinned both capitalism and Bolshevism. His speeches escalated in vitriol as the war progressed. In 1939, he delivered a stark ultimatum: "The Jew or us. One of us will have to go. We know that the Jew will lose, that he and his devilish, life-denying and destructive doctrines will be destroyed." As early as late 1939, Ley stated that if Germany lost the war, the German people would be exterminated, arguing, hence it should be rather the Jews who fry, rather they who should burn, they who should starve, they who should be exterminated. His awareness and advocacy for the extermination program continued until the regime's end. In his final speeches of 1945, Ley emphasized that the struggle against Judah was one of life or death, warning that if Germans lost, they would be exterminated to the last man. Ley was not just a mouthpiece. He shared responsibility for the National Socialists' persecution of the Jews, including the murder of a vast portion of Europe's Jewish population. As the Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Ley remained fanatically loyal, attending Hitler's final birthday celebration in the bunker on April 20th, 1945. He departed the following day for southern Bavaria, expecting a final confrontation in the Alpine stronghold. However, the final confrontation for Ley came not on the battlefield, but in a shoemaker's house in Schlecking on May 16, 1945, where he was captured by American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division. He attempted to conceal his identity by claiming to be Dr. Ernst Distelmeyer, but he was recognized and betrayed by a former Nazi Party official and longtime personal enemy, Franz Xaver Schwarz. Even in captivity, Ley's dedication to Hitler remained unbroken, declaring upon his arrest, "You can torture or beat me or impale me on a stake, but I will never doubt the greater deeds of Hitler." Ley was swiftly transported to Nuremberg and was included among the 24 leading officials indicted by the International Military Tribunal. The charges against him were severe. Count 1, conspiracy to wage aggressive war. Count 3, war crimes, including mistreatment of civilian populations. And Count 4, crimes against humanity, including murder, extermination, and enslavement. The former Labor Front leader was reportedly intensely indignant at the charge of being a criminal, barely able to utter the word when speaking to the prison psychiatrist. He became obsessed with the idea of martyrdom, desiring to escape the shame of the trial. On October 25, 1945, before the start of the International Military Tribunal, Robert Ley took the coward's way out, hanging himself in his cell in Nuremberg. He fashioned a noose from strips of a towel and secured it to the toilet pipe. His body was discovered before the trials commenced, meaning Ley and his crimes were never formally brought to trial. Before his final act, Ley left behind a written appeal, "To my German people," a document that remains steeped in controversy. The note urged Germans to rid themselves of anti-Semitism, claiming that Germany suffered defeat because of the Nazi anti-Jewish teachings. It declared, "We have forsaken God, and therefore we were forsaken by God. We put human volition in the place of his godly grace. In anti-Semitism, we violated a basic commandment of his creation. Anti-Semitism distorted our outlook, and we made grave errors. We Nazis must have the courage to rid ourselves of anti-Semitism. We have to declare to the youth that it was a mistake." While some commentators hailed this as a tremendous apology, others dismissed it as profoundly cynical, labeling it Ley's last lie. Critics pointed out that the testament was not a true confession of guilt for atrocities, but merely an admission of mistakes or excesses that had hindered the regime's greater plan. Ley renewed his pledge of loyalty to Hitler within the same document. Most damningly, Ley's appeal proposed a working compromise, a deal between Jew and anti-Semite, suggesting reconciliation only as a necessary pragmatic step for German survival. He concluded with a chilling threat: if the Jew refused his plan to help rebuild Germany, then the depicted world catastrophe will take its inevitable course. This final flourish suggested that, even in death, Ley continued to believe in the vast, magical power of the Jew as the all-powerful scapegoat and ultimate agent of global catastrophe. Robert Ley's life thus ended as it was lived, in a flurry of chaos, self-destruction, and contradictory pronouncements. He was an architect of the national community whose own excesses violated every principle of communal discipline, a fanatical anti-capitalist who championed worker rights, while simultaneously dismantling their political power and defrauding hundreds of thousands in the People's Car scheme, and one of the movement's most virulent genocidal anti-Semites, whose final words cynically attempted to pivot blame and rewrite the history of the movement he served so ruthlessly. He was a man of power who died alone, his final act of self-violence ensuring he escaped the very judgment he had helped orchestrate for millions of others.